Miss Stone. I suppose I should begin by showing you my reading journal, in which I've done the different reflections and questions that go along with each story that we read in class. I also have a list of what a good reader should be, according to Nabokov, that as a group we composed during class time. Despite my beginning struggles that I encountered as a critical reader at the very beginning of this class, frequent practice and consistent self-discipline has enabled me to demonstrate a moderate level reading growth. Taking into consideration the advice given by both Nabokov and prose, I have focused my attention onto the following points. 1. A good reader is a rereader. And 2. A good reader is aware of the author's selection of detail, including rhetoric and structure. To establish credibility and authority, I chose to go with the technique of honesty. This dates back to the very beginning of this course, in which I did my best to remain active in my reading. But because of the situations that constantly kept popping up, I found myself doing it just to get through. I would especially become frustrated with myself and reading in general when I would come across a difficult or confusing piece, which would be often. But because of my lack of time, I wouldn't actually dedicate much effort into trying to figure it out, although I was perfectly aware that this could potentially hurt me as both a student and reader. However, I knew that I hadn't given up entirely on working towards my goal of improving myself, because any spare time that I would get, I would actually dedicate it into going back and reading those particular pieces. But for the most part, I would really just rely on group discussions for understanding of passages and development of thought. However, I did notice that with each reread, I would actually get better at picking up the small details along with their significance and contribution to the work as a whole. This improvement is first begun to be seen in my reading of Brave New World, in which I noticed that Huxley's diction helped set the tone for the novel by implementing irony from the fact that although life was essentially created in the main building, it was enshrouded by a cold and lifeless environment. In this particular text, it was the class discussions that enabled me to look deeper and identify exactly how these details provided insight on Huxley's message. In this way, I was able to see that because of Huxley's description of the pale imitation of life, the novel was immediately marked as satire, which seeks to reform. My improvement in this point becomes even more evident with the Canterbury Tales, both prologue and Partner's Tale, in which I was able to effectively connect physical characteristics to internal features and criticisms. For example, I was able to understand the concept behind the summoner, in which his inner corruption manifested itself into its repulsive appearance. However, I did struggle a bit with picking up all of Chaucer's verbal irony. Often I would misread the text in which this technique occurred. It was for this reason that I missed the fact that the partner, for actively abusing people's faith for personal gain, was the character who received Chaucer's harshest criticism. Looking back to my first reading, it was evident how I grew as a reader. from the fact that I focused my attention on capturing the meaning behind each character's description in order to understand the direction in which the author was going with the social commentary. However, I know that rather than obtaining just the general idea behind each of Chaucer's pilgrims, I need to be much more mindful of how each character, this includes both their flaws and virtues, helps to represent a different segment of medieval society. It's a concept that I'll have to build on for the next text. I need to effectively identify the author's purpose in order to not simplify the work as a whole. This can also be applied to the Partner's Tale, in which I was able to connect and interpret each part. For example, I was able to understand how the personification of death transitioned into a physical form of greed and sin. I was also able to identify all elements of the archetypal narrative format within the story. However, I found myself struggling with trying to determine how this tale was consistent with the partner's character. For that reason, I missed the fact that the partner, because he had been so consumed by his own sins, found himself blinded or even hardened from the truth. Instead of recognizing this as a sort of social warning from Chaucer, I let myself be heavily influenced by my own personal assumptions. Taking into consideration the partner's dishonest and corrupt character, it was easy for me to disregard his tale along with its intended moral lesson. All this was done with the belief that the author intended to make the audience do that, when in reality he was really just laying out the concept of the liar's paradox, an insight gained from class discussions. Same goes for Beowulf, in which, by paying attention to the details, I found that Grendel could actually be said to be the mere reflection of Beowulf's corrupted side, based on the fact that both characters were people of immense pride. Given the details, one could also see how the characters help illuminate the purpose of an epic, which is to celebrate the accomplishments of legendary and heroic figures within the general public. Finally, with the guidance of class discussions, I was able to see how Nabokov's structure artistically reflected the three components of a good writer, quote-unquote, magic, story, and lesson, while prose structure, on the other hand, conveyed more the beauty of reading, both critically and for pleasure, as well as her growth as both a reader and a writer. Hopefully from this, I proved the fact that I've grown to some extent as a critical reader who, thanks to Nabokov and prose, is now more appreciative and aware of the small significant details put in by authors. Thank you for listening. That's it.